Humans are animals, conscious and mortal beings with restricted ability to affect their surroundings. Above all, death and pleasure are the primary biological drives in most living creatures. They act as beacons. The former is they to avoid and the latter they want to seek and sustain. Yet, mortality is an abstract concept, so it is concretely associated with suffering, a means of ensuring the safety of an individual. A stimulation, physically induced by tissue damage or inflammation, but also mentally induced by the loss of a loved one or even by boredom. In the case of enjoyment, ranging from sheer physical excitement to deeply rooted passion, it serves as a conventional medium to concentrate one's energy on a goal, an ideal that makes pain bearable. These innate factors lay the groundwork for effective conditioning. Moreover, we are data dependent. Individuals are reliant on perception in order to create a mental model that becomes the matrix of our reasoning. Thereby, people's upbringing, their peers, the culture in which they evolve, even what they consider ordinary, all play a role in strengthening one's confidence in his ability to differentiate truth from falsehood. In other words, they reinforce faith in a flawed logic prone to entertain delusions or be deceived by appearances. As Alfred Adler, one of the founding fathers of modern psychology, put it, every individual acts and suffers in accordance with speculative ideology. A religion, or more precisely a belief, can be defined as knowledge supposedly irrefutable by the mind. Although this term is conventionally reduced to organized religion, political factions, or schools of thoughts, it is in fact a deeply embedded system that allows humans to sift through our perception and to classify them by relevance. If we narrow it down, any sentient being must contain a dogma of some sort, otherwise, one will end up stuck in a thought paralysis, where multiple possibilities are ambivalent, leading to a stillness, lethal in most cases. And so, challenging someone's creed will involve questioning the sense of self built upon it, which could either lead to the shadowing of one's entire worldview or, more commonly, to the rejection of the evidence. In that sense, an individual can find himself acknowledging the limitation of others' conviction while remaining oblivious to his own. Like atheists and faithfuls, since both are ultimately believers. Eventually, individuals' lack of ideal will lead them to seek excitement at the expense of oneself or of the community as a whole. In the end, needs, desires, erroneous belief, even opposing opinions can wreak havoc into a society. Survival of our kind relies on the satisfaction of physiological needs, namely water, food, and shelter. Since then, living is based on a guarantee of physical integrity, as it supports growth, a future-oriented perspective, and so the extended fulfillment of those necessities over a long period of time. Still, we are a fragile species, not simply because of a lack of external defenses, but mainly because of the limited agency we are able to wield on our own. This condition is deepened by an ever-growing entropy, requiring us to maintain action in order to ensure the safety of our being. As a result, some degree of stability of our circumstances is necessary for us to prevail, a vital order provided by groups. Starting from villages and tribes, erected primarily upon our dependency on one another, those groups gather members through a collective ideal aimed at the perceived greater good. The compounded efforts of its adherents provide the organization with the required resources for it to remain. The emerging prosperity of the community allows for the development of tools and techniques improving the efficiency of the pursuit. These are levers capable of coping with finite workforce, a limited amount of land and crops to exploit, or a sudden growth of the population. People born and bred inside a community will share similarities in terms of languages, customs, or merely in a physical sense. Thus, they are inclined to interiorize their values and to consider their belief as the truth. therefrom embodying the resulting archetype designed to protect it. In this framework, primary socialization as well as reciprocal credence are compelling enough to sway individuals into submission, for without, one will be ostracized from the flock, bringing him to his demise in previous settings. However, the limited ability of those organizations to expand generates the necessity to exchange with external entities, and so, much larger structures, namely cities and states, are established as hubs for trades between communities. They gradually evolve out of needs, gaining a status of supracommunal entities that met the needs of their inhabitants. These systems' economical models are relatively simple. War, as well as the production and subsequent sale of crops and raw materials, feeds the expansion of the cultivable land conducive to a virtuous cycle of prosperity. These catalysts allow for the development of infrastructures and the enlargement of cities like Rome, Constantinople, or London into states, then into empires. In this context, the creation of jobs empowers the redirection of excess human resources that would otherwise wreak havoc in the structure towards productive endeavors. Nevertheless, contrary to communities, a divergence of incentives coupled with the absence of a direct reliance between neighbors makes this system prone to discord. Hereby, the new requirement for order leads to the introduction of formal laws and punishment and of an authority to enforce them. The erected institutions serve as regents supposed to ensure the stability of the edifice by maintaining the infrastructures, providing a medium of exchange, consequences for offenses, and overall promoting collective advancement. Regardless, the conditions that allow order to exist are fleeting, and so the sheer nature that erected this organization also predisposes them to degeneracy. The non-omniscient nature of our kind implies that we are unable to envision a perfect object, let alone create it on first try. Fundamentally, the ever-increasing chaos of reality means that the flawlessness of a design is ephemeral and requires a perpetual evolution in order to adapt to continuous changes. Moreover, our subjective knowledge constrains us to reduce the object of a study to a finite number of dimensions, which leads to simplification. The delimitation of the scope, rather through a methodical or arbitrary process, allows us to formulate a reflection by defining the elements that make up reality. The scientific method, supported by a structured framework, grants us with a glimpse of objectivity by minimizing subjective bias. Hence, our distinctive capability to conceptualize, grounding into reality by this approach, allows for a process of trials and errors, empowering the reduction of the number of flaws contained in our productions. Consequently, institutions and administrations, which are central to prosperity, are erected upon those conditions, and so are far from perfect. Their design, but especially the human factor they rely upon, make them prone to the same weakness that we ourselves manifest. In this regard, individuals' interests and beliefs, diverging from the intended purpose of the system, will generate corruption and falsifications. Thus, even if at their creation these organizations were quite suitable for their circumstances, over time they will more than likely be led astray and drift towards a progressive decay. On top of that, the secondary socialization will induce a trust in an establishment that has become the embodiment of a parental figure, or even because of a quasi-deification of the entity. This worship can cloud the population's judgment and strip away their ability to form a coherent thought on their own. Worse, a cognitively liberated model may prevail even in the absence of material evidence. Accordingly, one may entertain an idea to maintain the impression that it still possesses some degree of agency. And so, the prestige those organizations once held the trust placed in them, or their role of authority figures will be instrumentalized to benefit the agenda of the power in place with the tacit approbation of a close third, which might lead to the use of counterfeit science by institutions, the mismanagement of taxpayer money diverted for embezzlement, or more simply, the use of force by the ruling power against a demonized foe, namely political opponents or its own citizens. Indeed, in John Milton's words, the mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. From a chronological standpoint, the fragmentation of the Roman Empire at the end of late antiquity has led to a resurgence of city-states as one of dominant political forms, even if the fancies of the leaders can make the system prone to conflict anyway. This adoption may be the reason, along with a lack of significant technological advancement, for the gigantic amount of conflict in the continent during the Middle Ages. That being said, the absence of the means to expand the structure generates a pragmatic incentive for territorial expansion beyond one's boundaries, a behavior that could allow for a gain of resources as well as the use of an excess labor force that would otherwise wreak havoc within the system. All of which, in the end, promote the renewal of an equilibrium through the death of the expendables or the growth of the structure. The opening of the modern era, noted for its globalization by sea and the exploration of the Americas, drastically changed the economies of Western Europe, laying the foundation for contemporary world trade. In a cynical way, we could consider this extension of the arable land as a convenient escape forward, a flight that coped with an inability to generate a stable political regime or a proper system that would allow for a diffuse prosperity. Whatever the case might be, the way of living in our societies has, at this point, shifted towards an heavy reliance on a central political entity that limits internal dissents. And so, government doctrines that followed, mostly with economic incentive at their core, like large-scale slavery and colonization, empowered the birth of yesteryear's Western empires. Later on, the 18th and 19th century marked a drastic change in the trajectory of our kind. Indeed, revolutions were at the heart of the Age of Enlightenment, whether in the political or technological front. Firstly, conflicts inside and between great powers spread across Eurasia and the Atlantic world were legion. From government, driven by the requirement for money as a result of a regime change, namely in the case of France, with the Napoleonic Wars that followed the Reign of Terror, to indirect reasons, like a heavy reliance on trade and the need to forcibly impose it when other means of obtaining wealth fall apart, like in the case of the British Empire, to which the War of 1812 against the US, as well as wars against France, led to some degree to the Opium Wars against China. For instance, the disruption of its trade by American merchants created an incentive to expand their sales of other commodities in order to cope with a strained economy from lengthening conflicts. On the technological front, the agricultural revolution led by machinery and new methods progressively generated an exodus from villages due to the collapse of their bases. Thereby, this development had created an economic reliance on factories and specific industries as one of the main wealth contributors. And rightfully, as the significant gain in productivity injected a massive amount of capital into economies, fueling fairly prosperous times like the Victorian era, the Gilded Age, the French Empire, or the Gründerzeit. Nevertheless, the convergence towards cities generated a congestion that could hardly be coped with. In this case, the limited jobs available coupled with an ever-growing population, created in those systems an important disequilibrium. The developing inequality, caused by a disparity of wealth, led to the emergence of socialist movements through thinkers such as Marx, Engels, or Proudhon, as well as the renewal of crime syndicates exploding in the outlawed sectors. However, the dependency of those economies over specific sectors like steel or railways led to a systemic risk. And indeed, speculation and overinvestment created bubbles that, when burst, triggered bank runs, crises, and even depressions. The 20th century marked the apogee of the era, with conflicts and crises reaching an unprecedented scale. World War I and II may be the pinnacle of human-induced violence, with a cumulative death toll of over 70 million casualties. The machinery and scientific progress that once served to foster the development of societies were used to devastate them. If this wasn't enough, the economic downturns of this period also reached an unrivaled height, with the Great Depression and Germany's hyperinflation, which in the end caused World War II. In spite of this context, some corporations thrived, supplying weapons, raw materials, loans, and goods. In this case, banks, car manufacturers that turned to tanks, or R&D in the chemical and electronic industries prospered thanks to a war economy. Despite the chaos that permeated the first half of the century, the political tension did not ease afterwards. Though the threat posed by nuclear weapons may have diminished the number of fought wars between great powers, it was directly replaced by cold and proxy ones, specifically with the opposition of capitalism against communism. Of course, the limits of the latter became clear during this period. To put it simply, the reliance over institutions led to the deification of government and its leaders. This condition served as an architect of massacres and persecutions. Furthermore, the economic failure from poorly planned central economies that followed caused famines in Soviet Unions and during Mao's great leap forward. On the other hand, the insidious arms of capitalism, if it wasn't clear enough yet, surfaced during the following century. Of course, while induced poverty is obvious, the pecuniary incentive of this economic system is the real concern. The exception of post-World War II and its unusual circumstances, such as low unemployment rate and diffuse growth, promoted the expansion of society's basis. Firstly, the Eurasian need for reconstruction, as well as an inflow of cash into the US, empowered the expansion of the middle class thanks to an important productivity and Keynesian policies. Furthermore, technological advancement achieved under a mobilized economy were then redirected for a civilian purpose, enabling the development of infrastructure in various sectors like highways, aviation, or energy. Yet, the golden age achieved proved short-lived. Once growth reached saturation, stagflation rose. The increase in unemployment, coupled with the pouring of money into unproductive endeavors, as well as the first oil shock, signed the end of this peculiar moment. And so, the inability to expand the system led to a renewal of conflict as an economic mitigator, through which the military-industrial complex thrived. The collusion established between lawmakers and corporations, often achieved for government contracts through lobbying, laid the foundation for a significant disruption on the domestic soil. In the case of the US, Monsanto, producer of Agent Orange, colluded with government agencies to limit investigation regarding its commercial glyphosate. Moreover, the connivance of states with corporations may lead to detrimental policies such as the delocalization of factories, which destroyed cities, or through insidious promotion of war
against terrorism.
Accordingly, individuals and corporations, seeking their own interest or pressured to make money in order to survive, will adopt overall harmful behaviors such as the sale and heavy promotion of noxious products, scams, frauds, even resorting to crime at a great scale if necessary. To understand humans, we must acknowledge the animalistic nature concealed beneath layers of morals and ideals, a refinement that hides our primitive instincts. Though this level of sophistication is perfectly attainable under fortunate circumstances, it is not our primary state. Indeed, humans follow a subjective logic forged by past events and emotions. Every action we undertake, even the most reckless and destructive, appears perfectly reasonable to a mind constrained by its limited understanding or overpowered by its impulses. This imperfect knowledge of reality even keeps us from recognizing our own real interest. And so, overwhelmed by our impotence, we almost inevitably fall under the influence of a community and its creed, one that gives us a demonized foe or a deity. Thereby, the atrocities committed by mankind do not stem from an inherently inferior nature as such, but from unwavering faith in a flawed model that ultimately favors Bane. But in the end, despite our propensity for destruction, we are a rational species,